Let me say, first of all, very briefly, what I intend to do in this talk. I want to put a little bit of pressure on the concept of individualism in my talk today. I want to look at how it arose and the role it played in what is often thought of as early Western modernity, say in the 17th century. And I'm going to ask how it was thought to apply or not to apply to the world outside that Western modernity. Then I'm going to turn to a pair of concepts that I'm broadly going to label the self and the person as two ideas about the human being that are found in pre-modern Indian thought. And I'm going to use that pair to put a little bit more of a critical pressure on the notion of the individual. And I want to end by suggesting that individualism has a great many problems when it comes to talking about human beings and the way they actually live, as well as perhaps the way they ought to. So what is this concept of individualism? A dominant account of it goes something like this, that through changes in the intellectual climate that marked the emergence of modernity in Europe, sometime around the period of the late 16th and through into the 17th century, following on from the Renaissance, you saw this idea of the human being as each distinctive and driven by distinctive motivations, having a particular kind of interiority, that is to say, an inward awareness of their own subjectivity, their own experiences, and their own narratives about themselves. This idea, it is often claimed, arose in distinction to more diffuse senses of who we were in the pre-modern West and in other parts of the world, even at the time of the 17th century. This idea of individualism is then seen as justifying a particular narrative in the political history of Europe. It simultaneously seeks to secure the foundations of liberal democratic thought and the origins of a liberal polity in which individuals were seen as the way in which individualism was seen as the way in which human beings should be conceived of in relation to one another. And the primacy of that individual's own motivations, interest, and self-worth was supposed to feed into a larger contract by which society was able to flourish. At the same time as this notion of individualism, which was thought to generate such related notions as tolerance and equality between human beings in the society, was being propagated and developed, it was also being used in an extremely unequal, hegemonic, intolerant way in the justification of European empires. Because it was claimed, and it's continued to be claimed into the 20th and even to the 21st century, that societies in the rest of the world, which did not go through this process of individualization, which accompanied the birth of Western modernity, was seen as, in some sense, lacking that particular self-conception that allowed them to have the same interactions and therefore the same rights as European individuals. And even after empire passed, we still continue to have this idea that individualism was a particular characteristic of Western human beings. So, for example, in the literature on the sociology of India, we have had many influential notions of how to think about the Indian human. One idea was that whereas the Western individual or Western human being of modernity was an individual, the Indian, and particularly the Hindu person, was actually always thinking hierarchically, homo hierarchicus, and therefore thought of himself and herself in terms of a location within an hierarchy. Now, that basically meant that you could say if Hindus, and by extension other Indians in South Asia, thought in terms of who was above them and who were beneath them, then obviously it would not matter to them whether they were being ruled by emperors in India or emperors in London. You would simply have a justification for the continuation of a hierarchical self-conception of the human being in which there was a new set of rulers. And that, as I said, continued to be thought of as a structural analysis of human beings in India, even after the end of the British Empire. Another kind of idea, an American idea, was that whereas in the West you had an individual, in India we needed to think of human beings as individuals, that is to say, always in connection to others. And I remember, this is a little bit autobiographical, but it does set me on this larger intellectual trajectory. When I was studying these ideas, say in my late teens, I would really ponder on what exactly it meant for me to be not an individual in the way these self-assured French and British and American anthropologists were. Now, it could clearly not be the case that I couldn't withdraw into my own thoughts and be silent, apart from the very phenomenological truth that I did so. The vast literatures of India, going back to 1500 BCE, were replete with examples of interiority, of an extremely sophisticated sort. So it wasn't as if there wasn't a literary cultural narrative, and it wasn't as if phenomenologically it was impossible to think I or anybody else not Western could think of themselves as separate, as distinct, as having access to ideas about themselves, thoughts and feelings that were unique and not, in fact, simply shared or floating in relationality with others. And there was also a much trickier question of how exactly this concept of individualism was supposed to function. If indeed it was tied to the necessary conditions for a liberal democracy in which concepts of equality, for example, and freedom of social action were possible, then was it the case that, say, when the impeccably liberal democratic Indian constitution was formed, that at least the mothers and fathers of the Indian constitution, if not the hundreds of millions of people in India, suddenly became Western individuals? What kind of a psychological flip had been thrown? Moreover, if individualism was a continuous presence, an invention of a particular type of subjectivity in Western modernity, then what exactly was happening in totalitarian regimes of the West, or indeed authoritarian ones like Spain or Portugal or Greece, which did not even become liberal democracies until the 1970s. So we start having all these different kinds of questions about what individualism could possibly be. So I hope I'm able to at least establish a prima facie case that individualism cannot be taken seriously as a description of the phenomenology of subjectivity. It cannot be taken seriously as a kind of historically specific inauguration of a way of being human.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.